everyone. Thank you for signing up for this webinar on it's a rainy Friday afternoon or morning in California and Los Angeles. So I really applaud you for signing up for this. And I'm substituting in for the speaker who was originally signed up. And just to reiterate, my name is Holly Naimi. I have a law firm in Beverly Hills that focuses on tax, controversy, as well as planning. In terms of my experience, like hands-on experience with information reporting, I also represent businesses, small businesses, in connection with compliance, employment compliance, as well as 1099 issues that come up. One of the clients that I have is a private college that has to report information reporting, a mid-sized reporter for tuition that has to go to the IRS. I also represent a small healthcare company for home health, and also some small businesses like nail salons. And it's come up a lot, these issues. So very happy to go through some of these, the technicalities that are required. And if you have questions, please feel free to ask. If your question is not, you don't have an opportunity to ask at the conclusion of this webinar, you're welcome to contact me again. I have to disclaim that I cannot provide legal advice, but I can at least point you to the right direction where you can find some information, general information, and that way we wouldn't be violating or establishing attorney-client relationships, and by no means does this webinar establish an attorney-client relationship. So let's move on with the webinar. Okay, so that's me. Hi, Amy. I was asked to do this webinar listening through, and I noticed in terms of the benefits, and some people may disagree that other bullet points should be, which would take precedence over the listing sequence that I've listed here. But just some major issues that come up, and obviously bearing in mind the IRS's goal to really track down revenues that have been going to certain businesses without any sort of reporting. So just to go back, I want to make sure, hopefully everyone can hear me, but if you can't, if there's any technical difficulties, please send a note to the host, and hopefully he'll let me know. It's the first time I'm using my computer as opposed to a landline, so I hope that my voice comes through clearly, and I'll try to correct it if it doesn't. So in terms of best practices, you want to make sure that at the outset you establish service agreements with your vendors. If your clients have small businesses or medium-sized businesses, make sure you speak with the person in charge of the accounts payable to generate these service agreements at the outset before going forward. So if you're revisiting an existing business that's revamping its protocol and policies and procedures for issuing information reports, you want to make sure that those existing vendors are contacted and that there's W-9 forms that are completed and placed into their files. If you don't have those, and then on a going forward basis, obviously you want to have service agreements, have policies and procedures for your accounts payable person or whoever. If it's a small business, obviously maybe that person wears multiple hats throughout the firm. So you want to make sure that that policy is implemented so that service agreements with attached Form W-9s are circulated to any vendors that are new. The second point, obviously, regularly update your vendor list. So a lot of times with businesses, I was alarmed. I have clients that are under audit, and they have no clue that they had to issue 1099s, and they just weren't receiving the proper advice. They have investigated other taxes, and they don't really get compliance information, whether it's in-house or through an outside source. So you're the primary source for them. You want to let them know, please update your vendor list, because somebody, you could have policies in place and then somebody comes in and they're not self-auditing their accounts payable. So you want to be able to have a second eye, view your accounts payable vendor list, make sure that 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 Form W-9 is in there because that is pivotal moving forward with accurate 1099 reporting. You want to obtain a Form W-9 before making your first payment. This is the biggest mistake, and it's hard whether that should go in the first bullet point. Obviously, by the time, if they've received a payment from the company, that vendor is far less inclined to comply with the requirements submitting the Form W-9. And that's becoming, I'm seeing it both in terms of my practice and litigation and cases. I see far more Form W-9s circulated than they had been in the past. So, and you have to excuse my cold. I'm just getting over this horrible flu, so if I cough, I'm trying to take cough drops while I'm speaking, so hopefully my voice is clear. If you are in the business of settling cases, if you're an attorney or an accountant representing service companies, you want to make sure that that becomes a practice that's highlighted and you're reporting that to your clients. So the Form W-9 I put in the following bullet. You want to obtain the form, and there's a link that I provided for instructions on how to complete the form. And completing the form accurately is also very important, is getting it timely before payment is made or issued. And we'll go through, hopefully you'll have an opportunity, if you haven't already, to download the instruction form for the Form W-9. It's pretty self-explanatory, but I wanted to take some time and go through some of these issues that come up. So if you haven't had a chance to download it, please take a few minutes, a minute or two to download it while I go through this form. And I'm going to spend a good portion of time on this first page of the handout because I think it's really important that people get this information down. So I'm looking at the request for taxpayer ID number and certification. So this one has two purposes. You want to get the HIN, you want to get the correct name and information for tax purposes, as well as the certification that's required. So it's a two-part form, part one and part two. And we're going to go through the instruction. What is the purpose of this one? A lot of times when you're dealing with vendors that might be sole proprietors, they might not feel comfortable providing their social security number, obviously for identity theft purposes. So certainly you can advise them to apply for an individual taxpayer ID number to the IRS. And there's language in here for an A10 for adopted taxpayer IDs. And just to provide a little bit of background, I've had accountants ask, and a lot of the questions come into when they need to issue a 1099. So you have to be, we'll get into that more as we go through the slides, but you have to be very clear about who is a vendor and whether or not a 1099 is required and therefore W-9 required. So unless it's a trade or business activity, you wouldn't have to report that payment to the other party, to the vendor. So when I say vendor, that term is legalese, I suspect. It's distinguished from any personal expenses. So if you're living and you're paying in an apartment or condo and you're paying rent, you're not going to issue a 1099 to your landlord for that. However, if you do operate a business and you're leasing office space and that's part of your business, you would issue a 1099 to your landlord. So it just depends on the context, whether it's business or personal. So that's the purpose of the first part of the W-9 is to make sure that you get the proper business information, the name of the person, the business name to the extent it differs. And again, you don't need to issue a 1099, the information reporting, to a C corporation with some exceptions, and we'll get into that in more detail. So the general instructions, I'm just going through the purpose of the form is to gather the information that's required for information reporting. And a lot of people are familiar with the 1099 miscellaneous form, and I'll try to focus my discussion on that because that seems to be the most prevalent, but there are other information reporting forms that are required. They're listed in here, the various purposes of each of these, so you can go through if you want to. I think in lieu of regulations, they provide pretty detailed instructions, and they're very valuable. I think it would prevent a lot of problems for your clients to really go through these carefully. So if your client is a U.S. person or a green card holder, they would be a U.S. person. So did I say that right? If your client is a U.S. citizen or a U.S. alien, so a green card holder, they would be a U.S. person, and you would be required to obtain submit a W-9 form to them in order to get their tax ID number or social security number or employer ID number. Partnerships, corporations, companies, associations created or organized in the U.S. or under the law of the U.S. and a state or domestic trust also fall under the definition of those